Boys is a Dutch TV movie made in 2014 and directed by someone with a name I can't properly pronounce. It primarily focuses on a budding homosexual relationship between two teenage boys, Mark and a boy named.
De Sieger.
I will just say the letter S instead of his name, since it is physically quite hard, nearly impossible actually, to pronounce. As in, what looks like a G actually requires a sound that English speakers never have to produce. Therefore, I just can't say it. The two most notable aspects of this movie are its cinematography and simplicity. It's well shot in that it's very pretty to look at for the most part. The whole movie is very blue in wardrobe and tint, which sets a calm tone. As for its simplicity, it's really just a romance with merely a basic character arc as a plot. Unlike most other gay romance movies I've seen, and I've seen quite a lot, it's very focused on the romance and hardly focused on prejudice at all. This makes for a refreshingly happy movie. S is on the track team with a boy named Mark. They're selected, along with Steph and Tom, to compete in a major race. Mark is rather wild and unpredictable, whereas S is organized, focused, and tame. From the beginning, it's very clear that they're attracted to each other, and no scene fails to show that. One of the aspects of Boys I love the most is that every scene pushes the story forward, either developing Mark or S or their relationship. Nothing is filler, comedic relief, or overdramatic nonsense, which I see a lot in gay romance movies. It's simple and focused. Anyway, the four boys go swimming together, but eventually Steph and Tom leave, allowing Mark and S to have a bit of alone time. After having fun for a little while, they approach a log, stare at each other for a bit, and then Mark kisses S immediately reciprocating. I love this scene. It might be my favorite first romantic encounter in any gay romance movie. It was perfect. The build up throughout the scene and everything that led up to it was perfect. I seriously love this scene. Also, the little
Ben geen homo.
at the end just made it even more perfect. But before that glorious swimming scene, we see these two girls from a distance, Jessica and Kim. Basically, Steph goes for Kim, and in the process, continuously pressures S to flirt with and eventually date Jessica. Steph does this with no ill will, and mostly not on purpose, except for maybe the perfume scene.
Weet jij het?
Je moet wel ruiken, hè?
Adidas?
Goed gedaan.
But S struggles deeply with what he seems to think is an obligation to be straight. He is clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but he forces himself to follow Steph's lead and establish a relationship with a girl. On a side note, you probably noticed that shitty American pop song playing in the back of the clip I just showed. That happens a lot in the movie. Not shitty American pop songs, but pop songs that are very intrusive to the tone.
Hier, nog een keer. Weet je dit?
What's interesting is that the first time I watched this, it was on Netflix, and none of these were in the movie. Only when it was taken off Netflix and I had to watch it through some other means, I noticed that these songs were randomly in there, and it struck me as rather odd that they weren't allowed to be on Netflix, like maybe they didn't get the copyright or something. I wasn't able to find anything online about this situation, but it just strikes me as odd. So anyway, I think these really muck down the soundtrack, especially since they have such a great composer. Some of the original soundtrack sounds cheesy, but I think that the original soundtrack is much better at building an atmosphere. So, getting back on track, after the boys go swimming, S contemplates what occurred as he bikes home. I love the way the music combines with the slow motion and his facial expression to create this perfect atmosphere. And then even better comes this really well executed nonverbal communication the next day. The filmmakers had so much to pull off with this, and they did it perfectly. Just watch.
Hi. Hey.
We meet Mark's sister Neeltje, and his family dynamic is shown to be clearly different than S's, illustrating perhaps the source of the differences in their personalities. Then comes my least favorite scene in the movie. There are two distinct points in the movie at which this exact problem happens. The camera is in a low position, pointed upwards at characters jumping in slow motion, both times with very cheesy music playing, and those scenes made me want to die. It wasn't cheesy in an old-fashioned way, it was cheesy in a modern way, and perhaps cheesy isn't the best word for it, but that's the only word I can think of to describe why I hated these two scenes. I think the best way to describe them is to just show them to you. If I used ratings out of 10, these two parts alone would have brought down the rating by a whole number. I do think the movie would be a lot better without these two parts. They made me feel embarrassed for liking the movie and the soundtrack. As in, I probably wouldn't feel comfortable showing this movie to friends just because it has something this awful in it. So after they bounce around flirtatiously, they go on a trip to train for the big race. This is basically the last happy romantic part before the very end of the movie. S can't sleep, goes off into the woods with Mark, and they make out a little. Then they run over to the beach and stumble around for a bit. It's really unclear what they're doing, and they do it for about 16 seconds, so it's hard to ignore. They aren't kissing or wrestling or doing anything that makes sense. They're just holding on to each other while really off balance. All I know is that whatever this was supposed to portray, it didn't do it very well. So basically, the conflict with Jessica is suddenly at center stage as Mark finds out they're dating. However, this isn't really the huge climactic conflict. That really happens when S tries to make up for the Jessica thing by inviting Mark for a swim, only to stand him up. This is actually a very well explained decision, so it doesn't really feel like an arbitrary conflict like I'd expect a romance movie to have. S feels obliged to his family, to both make sure his brother is safe and to maintain a good relationship with his brother, and to society, to stay with Jessica. It makes sense that he'd get in that car, and when confronted by Mark, S would still choose to go against him. It is actually quite impressive of S to request to get out of the car later. But anyway, later S tries to apologize, but only with the word sorry, and Mark gets pissed and storms off. However, even though they completely failed at practice when they were mad at each other before, I guess now they're okay running while angry and win the race. Skipping past a scene I will discuss in a little bit, we get to the glorious, heartwarming end of them riding off into the night. This completes the movie pretty well, and all loose ends are tied up. Now that you understand the romance, let's discuss the subplot. When the subplot with S's father and brother is introduced, it's actually done at just about the perfect moment, when S is telling his dad about being promoted in track. Ed robbing S of his dad's attention is pretty much the point of this subplot, so having him interrupt this important news just really jump-starts that theme and works well as a character introduction. As the movie goes on, we see time and time again that Eddie always seems to have his dad's attention at the expense of S. In fact, there's only one scene in the movie in which S and his father interact without any mention of Eddie. A good example of this dynamic happens a bit later, when Father's Day occurs. S goes out of his way to find Eddie at his place of work, begs him for the money to buy a gift, goes to the shop to pick out something, makes breakfast, practically drags Eddie upstairs, and then gets pretty much no recognition. Eddie gets to lay on his father's right side, smile and laugh with him, and even play around to the point when S actually has to remove his dad's breakfast from the bed to avoid a spill. His dad hardly even glances at him the whole time. Perhaps the most damning event in this happens at the end when they're celebrating S's victory as a family. During this celebration, S's dad decides it's a good time to give Eddie his bike back. It's as if he doesn't even care that S just won the race, and that's precisely when S decides to give up on trying to please his father. Boys worked wonderfully with its coming-of-age story, using S's romance with Mark as a strong enhancement to his self-acceptance arc, and making the motorcycle subplot actually fit in with the tone instead of interrupting it. Only the pop songs and cheesy jumping scenes seemed extraneous. Everything else seemed necessary. This movie was really good, especially for a TV movie. This is my rating scale, based more off of whether or not it's worth a rewatch than its objective value. I give Boys a blue.